Thank you. I too want to join my colleagues in thanking all three of our, yes, we really are three of the best members that we have, honestly, and on what's even an appropriator would begrudgingly admit maybe the most powerful committee in Congress. But a couple of points and then a question. First, the point was made how open you guys have been, and I want to just underline that. I came to you, Mr. Chairman, early with my concerns about taxing tuition waivers. That's not in there now, and I appreciate that very much. I came to you on a number of other items, and where you couldn't accommodate me, you still offered a way forward. Mr. Neal made the remark, and I think accurately, that we are going to see a lot of you next year. I don't think you can do a change of this magnitude and not be coming back for technical changes. And I would invite my friends on the other side of the aisle to participate in that. You don't have to vote for the original bill to be part of fixes that you think will make it better. And I know both the chairman and Mr. Roscoe well enough to know that they'll seriously entertain those kinds of suggestions. So I see this as it's a huge step, no question. We haven't done anything like it in a generation and a half. But there'll be a lot of work flowing after this to continue to do, and there'll be something, I can assure you, that none of us anticipate today that will pop up, and I would urge you to do it. In that area, and we've talked about this before, there were a number of concerns that Native American tribes had. I know some of those were impossible to accommodate, just given the bird rule and some of the things you had to do, and there are limitations on policy, but I would encourage you to look at some of those areas going forward. I also want to say I'm with my friend Mr. Roscoe. $2,000 for a family that makes 73 grand is a lot of money, and the fact that you're doubling the standard deduction is a boon to everybody, but particularly those at the lower end that pay taxes. The fact that you're doubling the child tax credit, boon to everybody with children, and the fact that you've moved the refundable portion of that up to $1,400 for people that aren't paying any taxes at all, income taxes, I think is a huge thing. Two questions. First question is, my friends on the other side have made the point, well, this opens the door to cutting entitlements. I think it does open the door to entitlement reform. There's a big difference between reforming entitlements and reducing them, although I think in some cases at the upper end, having the same Social Security and Medicare plan for Warren Buffett and Donald Trump that you have for Ma and Pa Kettle on the farm that are living on Social Security, I think we ought to be looking at that. I think there are savings to be had and redirected. I'm not talking about cutting. And you may have to look at raising the caps. But just out of curiosity, in the tax system, how much of the taxes are income taxes, both corporate and personal, the total amount of revenue the government breaks in, versus payroll taxes?
Payroll, so the individual and the corporate together, $1.5 trillion or so, excise taxes, the payroll taxes, all those others for Medicare, Social Security, unemployment, on and on and on, are a huge part of the budget, and right now, frankly, they are helping programs that are financially in trouble.
Yeah, and I just say this to make exactly that point, and this is a debate that's most appropriate on your committee, and I would encourage you to have it going forward. If your figures are right, and I assume they are, Mr. Chairman, the entire discretionary budget of the United States of America is more than covered by income taxes. So if you have a problem, it's because we are not funding Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security at the level it takes to pay for themselves. We're drawing down the Social Security Trust Fund right now. We know we're not putting enough in there. Now, again, we have a surplus for a reason. Great bipartisan compromise of '83. The baby boomer generation that's often accused of drawing this down did put the money in there. That's the point. They saved the system for their parents. They built up a reserve. But we know, because lifespans are so much longer now, that we're going to have to revisit these kind of issues. That's not cutting. That's deciding, that's right-sizing what these programs ought to be and whether they should be one size fits all or we should get nuance. But it is important to know that the entire defense of the United States and all the discretionary programs, things that I love, like funding the National Institute of Health to cure disease, or Center for Disease Control to protect us all, or TRIO, the Help First Generation students and Gear Up. Those students usually are being drawn from households that pay very little in the way of income tax. They deserve every bit as much in the way of benefits and opportunities as every other American. So the income tax portion of this is really paying for all of that now. So we're not talking about cutting entitlements. Second question, and Mr. Neal, this is directed at you.
Can I answer the first one as well, Mr. Chairman?
Oh, well, absolutely. I'll give you a chance to do that, and I'll come back to the next one.
Thank you.
Please. Absolutely.
So the argument that I think that it applies here is that the payroll tax really is the most onerous tax that middle-class Americans pay. I think that's a fair assertion. But at the same time, if you follow the logic of the argument and point you made, which is legit about expanded life expectancy in America, that means that there's going to be a greater reliance upon Medicaid for dementia and for Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely true.
So that's part of this argument. I mean, we can't celebrate on one hand expanded life expectancy and then on the next hand say that we're going to cap this benefit or cap that benefit. We know Mr. Johnson signed the Medicaid Act. It was almost an afterthought. It was for the poor. Today, it's nursing home care. 70 cents on the dollar
Oh, believe me,
goes to Medicaid. From Medicaid to nursing home care.
You and I have a lot of common ground here. It's why we
Remember the other part of it as
tripled the
well.
amount of funding for Alzheimer's.
Remember the other part of it as well. The genius of Medicare and Medicare and Social Security is that we do treat them as earned benefits because of the payroll tax.
No, look, we don't disagree. We just, and we're probably closer to agreement than you think in terms of there not being sufficient money going into those funds, and that we ought to look at raising caps and restructuring burdens. Because we are in a very different era than when these programs were designed. They're just demographically not sustainable anymore. So it's not a matter of people wanting to cut them. It's if you don't change them, they're going to go bankrupt. So we got to do that, and you guys and E&C will play a big role in that.
You're leading to a key point. Social Security and Medicare is so important, but they're made solvent by, and they're paid for how many people are working and what kind of salaries are they getting. And we've got too many people who aren't working and paychecks have been stagnant for a decade or more. This type of pro-growth tax reform gets people back in the workplace, gets them getting salaries and paying into Social Security and Medicare. This is incredibly helpful to shore up those programs.
No, I agree with that, and I think we're seeing an anticipatory reaction to that in terms of the higher growth we've seen the last couple of quarters, and good job creation and a relatively low unemployment, although we've got a lot of people, how you define who's unemployed, who's not, is worth looking at too. But one question, and Mr. Neal, did in the committee, and I don't know the answer, I'm serious, did Democrats present an alternative tax proposal?
No, we didn't. We offered a series of amendments, Tom. And the purpose of the amendment offering was to change the contours of the tax debate. And that didn't happen. And I think that part of our response was based upon the idea that there were no hearings. This all took place in less than 1 month. And in the conference committee, we were fairly limited to asking Tom Barthold questions after we offered opening statements, which only contributed to the incendiary nature of how the conference committee played out. My own impression is that there was not really an effort here to extend the opportunity for us to have developed a plan with the majority. And Mr. Roscom congratulated me for suggesting that a tax markup ought to occur during the daytime. I got to tell you, Kevin agreed to that immediately because that's just good policy. I mean, the idea that we're going to rewrite the tax structure of the country and go into 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, it only gives one side the opportunity to say that this was done in darkness. And I think in this instance here, we agreed, concurred quickly, that it would be done during the daytime hours. And I don't think we went beyond 7 o'clock at night.
But I think Chairman Roscom agrees with that approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could, I mean, that's in contrast to the way the ACA was passed. So, I mean, let's just sort of speak to it. I think the larger point that I was making was this, and that is I perceive this process that yielded this result differently than Mr. Neal. I don't view this as a 1-month process. I view this as a 5-year process. The prelude to this was Chairman Camp's draft that the Ways and Means Committee put together, then Chairman Ryan, and then now under Chairman Brady. So the notion that this has been done in basically 30 days, I would think I'm arguing is an overcharacterization. And I think I will, however, stipulate that we will be making changes. Obviously, something of this consequence will have to be revisited, and that will be true by definition.
gentleman yield?
By all means.
So on the camp proposal, I must congratulate David Camp because of the way that it was modeled. And he broke it down into a series of subcommittees, and we took testimony, publicly and privately, from scores of people and individuals. And Mr. Camp came back with a recommended 25% corporate rate. Mr. Obama and Jack Lew, they came back with a corporate rate of 28%. Hence, the argument, well, maybe between the two of those, we could have found common agreement and kept many of the preferences and exclusions in the code. So the idea that this was all going to be done for repurposing the idea of a postcard really didn't happen, Tom.
Well, unfortunately, the Senate gets a vote around here. Because I think my friend would have come much closer to realizing that than our friends on the other side. And we had an opportunity to ask just that question, and that's basically the answer we got. We needed to move, and there's a lot of compromises in this bill. As I said, there's some ways in which I think the Senate improved our bill. I think there's multiple ways in which we improved their bill, including starting the corporate income tax immediately. You don't have a year's worth of hiding taxes and tax avoidance. Just tell them you got a tax cut in a year and see what happens to your economic activity. So you guys made a lot of changes. Let me just end with this, because I've gone over the time. Didn't mean to. I just want to thank you all. I really do. I think I agree with Mr. Rossum's point. I've watched this. Dave Camp's a good friend of mine, and I went to a lot of these dinners and briefing sessions he had for people that weren't on the Ways and Means Committee. I served with Paul Ryan on the Budget Committee for 4 years, and then watched him at Ways and Means do the same thing. I've watched my friend, the chairman, build on that. So I think you've actually got a very long process here, a lot of discussion, and I think you've improved the product over the course of that. I think you can improve it again. You know, people forget this, but after Obamacare was passed, we actually did pass 7 or 8 pieces of legislation, got rid of things like 199, the tax forms that everybody was going to have to do, and there are a number of things that said that were Republican ideas that Democrats adopted that probably did strengthen the bill fiscally at least, and at least came together. So I would hope my friends on that side understand having a big fight, and understand we have a big disagreement here, and I think that's legitimate. I mean, that's politics. On the other hand, I think this process will be an ongoing one. You know, I think we improved the Bush tax cut, strangely enough, in the fiscal cliff debate, which I voted for that. It generated more revenue in the end, but it locked down tax cuts for people making less than $50,000 a year. It saved 85% of those tax cuts for 98% of the American people. And where there was an adjustment up to deal with the revenue situation, you know, because I reminded people at the time, this is actually a tax cut because all these things are going to be gone and everybody's going to be better off. I think this process will work the same. So hope going forward, after we have a robust debate, that the process for improvement continues, that the doors open, and that the minority participates in that. I know they will. My friend Mr. Deal is very able, because I think this is a good product, but I think it can be made better. I think it will be made better. That, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.